Donald Trump's return to the White House in 2025 has reshaped global politics overnight. For months, he promised he could end the war in Ukraine in just 24 hours. Now the world is watching to see how he'll deliver on that pledge. Many expected a major shift in approach, but what happened next surprised everyone. Rather than stepping back or bending to Putin's demands, Trump has flipped the script. His administration is taking a hard line. If Russia doesn't agree to end the war under terms both sides can accept, then Moscow will face economic consequences far worse than anything it has seen before. So what changed? And does Trump really have a plan to bring this war to a close? Let's break it all down, starting with Trump's stance on the conflict. According to previous statements by the current US president, the war in Ukraine should have never started, and he had a plan to end it within 24 hours of assuming office. While we can safely say that the 24-hour claim has been a bold and intentionally hyperbolic claim, there's some truth to the fact that Trump actually does want the war in Ukraine to end as soon as possible. But the reasons for that might not be what you think. In his previous statements during the election, Trump didn't provide any specific claim or plan on how to end the war. Pretty much every interview ended with a roundabout exclamation that essentially boiled down to, "War is bad." But there was no tangible plan or directive in place that the public could latch onto. Some of the claims that could be taken at face value, at least as much as possible considering the sheer amount of them Trump has issued over the years, suggested that Trump is more than willing to strike deals with Russia, and even possibly Ukraine, to bring the war to a satisfactory end. Satisfactory for whom, though? That's a whole other question. In a statement on September 10, 2024, Trump openly dodged the question of whether he wanted to see Ukraine win the war, only repeating that it needs to end for both parties involved. Politico argued that this roundaboutism is one of the clearest statements the president-elect has given to that point. It showcased that his priorities may lie in pacifying Russia. This is consistent with the often complicated history Trump has with Putin. In 2018, Russian intelligence services were accused of interfering in the 2016 election, the same one that gave Trump the office for the first time. Trump denied this involvement, which could be considered an attempt to placate and cozy up to Russia, considered one of the world's greatest powers at the time with extensive economic and geopolitical networks. But even then, the Trump administration often made decisions that seemed to go directly counter to the rhetoric used by the president at the time. As early as 2017, the US approved the sale of anti-tank weapons and equipment to Ukraine, even though it and Russia were in a state of partial conflict, and the act would be considered offensive to Putin. Similarly, the US imposed sanctions on Russia as a response to the latter supporting destabilizing regimes in the Middle East, its annexation of Crimea, and further escalation of conflict in Ukraine. While the first rounds of sanctions started as early as 2014, the Trump administration extended their duration throughout his term, as did the subsequent administration of Biden. Even more confusingly, despite claiming that he knew Putin well and was willing to make deals, concessions, and honest agreements with him, Trump also advised Putin against attempting to destabilize Ukraine and the Middle East as early as 2017. This hot and cold approach seems to have transcended to Trump's second term in office, as his views have only marginally changed since then. If anything, it's apparent that Trump believes that the US needs Russia to be at peace, but without an actual plan or idea of what that peace constitutes. Trump's long-standing opinion and relationship with Russia are further complicated when we throw NATO into the mix. While NATO is the world's most powerful military alliance, it's no secret that the US is pulling considerable weight in terms of manpower, technology access, and sheer offensive and defensive potential. The US has the largest arsenal, air forces, naval forces, including aircraft carriers, and long-range capabilities. The latter was showcased as recently as November 2024, when the US military launched a series of devastating strikes on Iran and Iran-backed proxy militias throughout the Middle East. The main avenues of attack were bombers and fighter jets, typically of the previous generation rather than the most contemporary. The attacks showcased that with over 750 military bases in over 80 countries, the US still has the logistical capabilities to ferry its troops anywhere in the world. These military bases are most prevalent in Japan, Germany, and South Korea, in that order, to provide national defense improvements against China, in the case of Japan and South Korea, or Russia, in Germany's case. But if you look at the NATO alliance at the time of Trump's first term, it was clear that other countries were severely over-relying on the US. The alliance recommends that each member country contribute at least 2% of its GDP to the organization's military and national defense budgets. Only 3 members met this recommendation before 2014. For reference, the US remained one of the proportionally highest contributors, consistently funneling between 3.5% and 3.8% of its GDP to its military annually. Only Poland and Estonia contributed more, proportionally, to NATO's national defense programs in 2024. Out of the other economic powers, only the UK consistently contributes around 2% of its GDP on defense. Germany, France, and Italy all contributed less than 1.5% annually prior to the war in Ukraine. The significant imbalance in defense spending among NATO members led Trump to push for increased contributions from allies. Some reports speculated that Trump might consider reducing the US's role in NATO if other countries didn't meet their defense spending targets. However, leaving NATO entirely would be unprecedented and lacks a clear legal framework within the alliance. At the same time, Russia considers NATO to be one of its biggest causes of conflict, as the alliance's slow expansion over the years has caused practically every Eastern European country to either be in NATO or allied with Russia. This has created something similar to the Cold War's Iron Curtain, where countries are either turning toward Russia or to the West for economic support and geopolitical influence. With a few exceptions, the NATO alliance contains most of continental Europe, and the two most recent members, Sweden and Finland, have a particularly long history of warfare and tensions with Russia. The US potentially leaving the alliance would have likely been considered a significant geopolitical victory for Russia. Without one of its largest and most powerful members, not to mention the only one with a nuclear arsenal to rival Russia's own, NATO would have significantly less sway in trying to guide Russian and Eastern European policies. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, the US is arguably the single biggest contributor to NATO-led donations to Ukraine throughout the war. The American military industry has been responsible for providing tanks, ammunition, anti-air defenses, and long-range missiles, all of which Ukraine has used to great effect to prolong the war as much as possible and ruin Russia's military and reputation. But there's a possibility that no matter whether the US is in NATO or not, its presence might not have any effect on how much help Ukraine receives. Shortly after taking office, the Trump administration paused certain non-military aid to Ukraine for a 90-day review period, with the possibility of extending the pause. However, President Zelensky confirmed that military aid, which is crucial to Ukraine's defense, has continued without interruption. This suggests that Trump is prioritizing a resolution to the war over personal history with Putin, seeking a position that appears neutral while maintaining US strategic interests. Only for Putin, anything less than full-blown support for the Russian cause means that the US might as well have said that its military is on the verge of entering the war itself. There's another angle that Putin might have been hoping for when Trump took office on January 20th. One of the main reasons behind the escalated conflict in Ukraine has been the fact that the country has started to approach the EU and NATO for entry. While the prospect of NATO membership has been broached before broadly, Ukraine applied for EU membership mere days after the invasion started. By linking itself with NATO and Western Europe in general, Ukraine has been culturally, demographically, and technologically shifting away from its Russian influences, and this has been a huge issue for Russia. You see, Ukraine is a land rich in natural resources, being one of the world's major grain exporters, but also having sizable deposits of metals, coal, graphite, and natural gas. The metals range from iron, manganese, copper, uranium, titanium, and more, some of which are the biggest deposits of their kind in Europe. In particular, copper, uranium, and iron are all critical for some industries, such as manufacturing or energy production. But Ukraine doesn't currently have the capabilities to exploit these reserves fully. If Ukraine does manage to enter the EU and NATO, all of those resources will likely be funneled into Western Europe. Alternatively, Ukraine will be able to get a much higher price for them when selling to an industry-first country like China. Either way, it allows Ukraine to catapult its industry and general quality of life off its resources. Conversely, Russia's invading Ukraine shows that Putin, and perhaps China, holds a vested interest in containing these resources for themselves. This leads to a situation where Putin doesn't want to give up on the war unless the US, or rather Trump, reverts many of the policy changes that happened since the conflict began. These include Ukraine no longer using long-range weapons in Russia, reduced weapon shipments from the US or NATO as a whole, recognizing the territories Russia occupied as belonging to Russia, lifting economic sanctions from the previous several years, prohibiting Ukraine from joining NATO and controlling its EU accession. The reversed course would essentially put Ukraine back in Russia's sphere of influence, which would make it similar to Belarus. Another aspect that slightly complicates matters is the fact that Russia and the US are technically part of a proxy conflict in the Middle East. Russia is one of the main weapon and equipment exporters to Syria and Iran, the latter of which has been funding anti-Israeli militia in the neighboring countries. In response, Iran has been supplying Russia with vital long-range kamikaze drones like the Shahed 136s that have been peppering Ukraine for years. On the other hand, the US has donated more economic and military aid to Israel than to any other country in the world. It's led to the country being one of the few that could essentially create an anti-air wall that protects it from long-range interference. With Israel and Iran and its proxies being in open conflict, Putin could be hoping that settling the war in Ukraine in his favor would put Ukraine in his sphere of influence, reduce the amount of geopolitical pressure NATO can exert, and help Iran in its conflict against Israel. On the flip side, the US doesn't know how much Russia is banking on prolonged warfare to eke out a win, and that the deal brokered by the US is perhaps one of its only remaining chances to get out of the war without losing another 100,000 or so soldiers and completely demolishing its economy in the process. To that end, Trump could also stand to gain much from being diplomatic with both Russia and Ukraine. First, it could allow the US to control where and how Russia sells its oil and natural gas. Currently, the US buys some of its oil from India, which buys its oil from Russia. In 2023 alone, the US purchased fuel worth approximately $5.14 billion. This happened as a result of the Biden administration banning direct purchases of Russian oil in the US. A new deal could cut out the middleman and even potentially create a lucrative enough offer for Russia to slow its exports to China. This would allow the US to practically dominate the oil trade, as China still hasn't created enough alternatives to naval shipping. Why does this matter? Well, Trump made other bold claims, such as using the military to police the cartels in Mexico, wanting to conduct massive deportation campaigns to remove illegal immigrants, and proposing an overhaul of the country's nuclear and aerial defense systems. All of these programs cost an exorbitant amount, and whatever Trump gains in his deal with Russia could be used to fund them. Another program that Trump has tried to bolster is domestic manufacturing. The most recent bold claim is to impose significant tariffs of 20% or even 60% on products coming from Mexico or China, respectively. This could have positive consequences for the domestic industries, but will be an untenable program in the short term, as the price of certain consumer and manufacturing goods might skyrocket. Trump's strategy may also involve leveraging the US's military dominance by negotiating better defense agreements with NATO allies, potentially requiring greater financial contributions or military purchases. For the US to stay in the alliance, Trump might demand the other members start spending more of their budgets or even directly pay the US to gain access to vital defense equipment and systems, such as sharing the nuclear umbrella that the US has built. The same concept could apply to countries in the Indo-Pacific, specifically with South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. All of these countries have ongoing conflicts or disputes with North Korea, Russia, and China, respectively. With all of the latter three countries possessing nuclear or nuclear-capable weaponry, the US extending its nuclear defense coverage to South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan could be a lucrative economic endeavor. Simultaneously, the sheer effect that the US protection implies would mean that the actual involvement of the military could be minimized, as even China is unlikely to stir up a conflict with the US for at least a few decades, at least according to most estimates. North Korea is somewhat of an outlier here, considering that Russia has started trading extensively with North Korea, sending food and technology in return for ammunition, particularly artillery rounds. Russia practically holds the reins for North Korea's weapons advancements. If Russia chooses not to divulge its most effective missile technologies and systems, it would keep North Korea as a relatively small thorn in South Korea's side, that the latter will be asking the US for occasional assistance and military equipment sales. Finally, on the Israel front, the US working with Israel means that Trump could try to influence how much military equipment Iran is receiving from Russia. While Israel is estimated to have a decisive industrial and technological advantage, Iran has ramped up its defenses. If more of the same comes from Russia, the conflict could last for much longer than anyone would be comfortable with and could cause more humanitarian crises. With all these factors in mind, it's clear why Trump is trying to downplay his friendly disposition with Putin. Both leaders have plenty to gain by being diplomatic and cutthroat in attempting to carve out the best deal to end the war in Ukraine. However, Trump has a decisive advantage in that the American economy is not on the brink of collapse, and that the country's demographics have not plummeted due to an exodus of capable professionals and vastly increased death rates for inexperienced and young soldiers like Russia's had. Somewhat worryingly, the actual effect this could have on Ukraine could just be an afterthought in the context of larger details. If Zelensky doesn't agree to these terms, and Trump makes good on his promises to stop military donations and force NATO to back out of supporting the conflict, there's no telling what would happen on the front lines in Donbass and Kursk. So where does that leave the current comments between Trump and Putin? Putin doesn't like to lose, which is not surprising considering he's been a president for over 20 years in a country that initially supported only 2 4-year terms. This means Trump's attempts to downplay Russia's current gains in Ukraine or asking for too much during the peace settlement could aggravate the matter further. Somewhat paradoxically, Trump's own cabinet might be more difficult to persuade, as the prevailing rhetoric so far has been that Russia has been the definitive attacker and that Ukraine has full rights to defend itself. After all, the US administration under Biden allowed Ukraine to use long-range missiles in Russia's territory offensively, which caused yet another escalation and talks of using nuclear weapons or ballistic missiles from Russia's side. Then there's the matter of Russia itself being somewhat of a loose cannon. Putin has made plenty of threats to use nuclear weaponry throughout the war, which has caused NATO to falter in delivering some vital military equipment and systems. Most of these red lines have been crossed one way or another without Russia responding in any meaningful way, but that may not last. If Russia decides to use nuclear weapons, there's no telling what sort of chain reaction that could cause. Firstly, Ukraine is geographically close to Russia as is, so large-scale attacks would end up hurting Russia and Ukraine's neighboring countries as well. In a more realistic scenario, the nuclear missiles will be intercepted by existing anti-air systems. However, if the US stops budgeting to send the system, Ukraine might be left defenseless. Similarly, Putin knows that Trump doesn't have a stellar track record when it comes to making promises and bold claims during his presidential campaigns. He can use that to his advantage to get some of his priorities straightened. Until then, though, Russia would have to settle for being on the back foot, at least until the Trump administration can take a precise stance on its military donations and influence how NATO approaches the conflict. But what do you think? Will Trump get everything he wants from Putin? And how much will he have to cede? And what is Ukraine's role in ending the war? Thanks for watching, and leave your comments below.